Welcome to a neighborhood you won't see in a tourist brochure.
So they come out Mondays and Fridays and help with like wound care and trying to help everybody get off the streets and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's true, if you change places and things, you can't change people ever, but you can change yourself and things and places.
This isn't a movie, and it's not a set. This is Kensington. A place where the streets are littered with trash makeshift shelters stretch across every block. And life operates by a completely different set of rules. How did such a place exist in the middle of a major city? Why did every attempt to intervene fail? And most importantly, how did all of this become normal? Get ready, because you're about to see a side of Philadelphia that few people want to talk about. Number 1. Where the light no longer shines in the heart of Philadelphia. Kensington stands out, not for its architecture or tourist attractions, but for the sheer density of homeless people living on its sidewalks. At any given time of day, it's easy to see people huddled in rows of tents set up along the sidewalks, where people try to create some privacy with plastic tarps and cardboard boxes. According to the 2024 local census, there are about 1,200 people without permanent housing in the area, accounting for more than 20% of the city's total homeless population. The nearby shelter system is often over capacity, with occupancy rates exceeding 90% in the winter. The area is not simply a temporary settlement, but has formed a living ecosystem that has lasted for years, with permanent tents rotating free food distribution points and ambulances on duty almost every day. Government intervention is usually short-lived, consisting mainly of clearing up belongings and asking people to move out, but after a few weeks, everything returns to normal. Amid all this, one thing remains puzzling. How did a city with one of the most advanced health education and welfare systems fail to stop the spread of an area like Kensington? There was no shortage of infrastructure. There were no shortage of resources. Yet Kensington remained the same for years. By the end of 2024, the number of emergency public health interventions in the area had increased by 18% compared to the same period last year. The majority of these cases involved loss of consciousness, exhaustion, or reactions after using a hard drug. Several streets have been prioritized for morning checks due to a significant increase in trash and collected needles, especially around public areas such as bus stops or near old abandoned schools. Kensington is not unique in its homeless population. What makes it so striking is that it illustrates a social structure that has lost its ability to self-regulate, where the problem is no longer temporary but entrenched. Number 2, from prosperity to decline. Kensington was once one of Philadelphia's most dynamic manufacturing areas. In the early 20th century, the area was home to hundreds of textile mills, machine shops, and metal fabrication facilities, drawing workers from all over. Employment was stable, housing was well developed. Schools, markets, and social services were plentiful. The area served as a strategic transit point for goods, thanks to its proximity to the railroad and shipping port. Economically, Kensington was the backbone of the industrial working class. However, from the 1950s onwards, the rapid pace of mechanization and automation made it difficult for small factories to remain competitive. Between 1970 and 1985, a number of local businesses closed or withdrew from the city. At the same time, unfavorable credit zoning policies, particularly residential mortgage limits, made it impossible for many families to renovate or resell their homes. By the late 1990s, many of the city's signature three-story buildings were vacant, infrastructure was not maintained, and public facilities were closed due to budget cuts. As population density declined and property values declined, Kensington was increasingly excluded from urban renewal investments. The slow allocation of resources combined with historical financial barriers left the area behind in nearly every city modernization plan. It is worth noting that while Philadelphia's downtown has grown rapidly since 2000, thanks to a wave of urban renewal, Kensington has remained fragmented in its transportation system, housing structure, and population density. This has led to a growing gap in development between neighborhoods just a few blocks apart, but with a marked difference in living standards and access to basic services. There has been much debate in recent years about how a once economic powerhouse became a sustainable laggard. The land is still there. The transportation options are still there. The basic infrastructure is still there. So what factors have kept Kensington from recovering? This pattern of prolonged decline is not an accident. It is the result of selective investment, unequal distribution of resources, and the gradual dismantling of public support systems. When public services are repeatedly cut over decades, the process of social reconstruction is halted. Kensington did not fall into crisis overnight. It happened slowly, policy by policy, decision by deprioritization, until the gap between the prosperous past and the present became irreversible. Number 3. Consequences beyond control. Between 2015 and 2024, fentanyl-related deaths in Philadelphia doubled. In 2023 alone, the city recorded more than 1,200 cases of loss of control after using the substance accounting for more than 80% of all emergency response cases. The Kensington area is the highest concentration. Fentanyl is not the only one having a profound impact. Xylazine, a veterinary sedative mixed with many street drugs, has been widely distributed in the area since 2022. The substance slows the heart rate, rapidly lowers blood pressure, and is particularly prone to causing serious harm if not promptly intervened, leaving many cases with no chance of recovery. According to the 2024 Metropolitan Health Surveillance Report, xylazine was detected in more than 90% of random samples tested at community intervention sites in Kensington. It is not regulated like other substances, so its circulation on the informal market is virtually unrestricted. When combined with fentanyl, the risk of prolonged loss of consciousness and central nervous system effects becomes more pronounced, leaving many people in a state of incapacitation for hours on the streets. Instead of rotating between support points, users gradually formed a habit of staying in one place, increasing the density of people lying in place for long periods of time. This was the direct cause of the streets in Kensington becoming the area with the highest rate of fixed gatherings in the city. Some streets, such as Kensington Avenue, had to coordinate medical patrols every 4 hours to check consciousness and vital signs. One often surprising detail, a dose of fentanyl or tranq on the informal market costs just $2 to $5. That's less than the cost of a basic dinner or a round-trip bus ticket. This explains why relapse occurs regardless of personal finances. If in a modern city, the price of a dose is cheaper than the price of a night's accommodation, in which direction is the social preference structure operating? Further analysis shows that the proportion of people who combine multiple substances on the same day has increased rapidly since 2021. This has not only a physical effect, but also puts a lot of pressure on the nervous system, making them less able to respond to the environment around them. Unsanitary living conditions, long-term exposure to humidity, and inadequate nutrition further weaken the body, leading to the risk of serious damage. As the abnormal becomes the norm, Kensington reflects one thing that is clear: this crisis is no longer confined to the old model. Support areas, public services, and the entire health system are being forced to adapt to a new reality, one where the line between emergency and routine has all but disappeared. Number 4. The other side of the edge. In Kensington, a form of informal exchange takes place on a daily basis between individuals living in temporary accommodation and those seeking services outside the traditional economic system. Gathering points are often located along high-traffic routes near public transport or close to areas where goods are distributed. Transactions are direct, rapid, without fixed intermediaries and without any specific form of organization. Aggregated data from 2021-2023 from the city agency recorded an average of more than 500 interventions per year in the boroughs surrounding Kensington related to unregistered exchanges. But this figure understates the true scale, as much of it occurs outside of regular monitoring. A common feature is that participants tend to stay in familiar areas, as survival needs are tied to access to basic services such as a place to sleep, food, and essentials. Of the cases treated, up to 65% involved people using powerful substances. More than half had traces of fentanyl or mixed compounds. This dependence is not only physiological, but also survival-related. To maintain a minimum level of energy and access temporary support, many people are forced to return to the same spot every few days. So, in an urban environment where everything is measured and monitored with data, how can a non-standard operating chain persist so persistently that it almost forms its own structure? Kensington is not only a place where problems abound, but where the problems are so intertwined that they are almost self-perpetuating. When one is forced to choose between leaving with nothing or returning to the place one has become accustomed to, the possibility of re-establishing stability is almost no longer a realistic option. Number 5. Even the police are powerless. Kensington has a 30% higher police deployment rate than its neighboring boroughs. The area averages 80 to 100 emergency calls a day, mostly for assaults, vandalism, or uncontrolled medical interventions. But the frequency of police presence does not reflect stability. Patrols often repeat routes, hitting familiar spots and re-encountering cases they handled days earlier. Part of the force is assigned to respond to recurring incidents at fixed sites where substance users regularly congregate, where makeshift tents are erected shortly after each cleanup. The ability to respond to violations in these settings is limited by two factors: the lack of immediate alternative accommodation and the lack of viable compulsory treatment in the current environment. Law enforcement in Kensington is unlike other parts of the city. Interventions often take longer than usual due to the need to coordinate with healthcare, social services, or the fire department. Notably, nearly 60% of minor arrests in the area result in release within 48 hours due to lack of long-term detention, lack of concrete evidence, or inappropriate prosecution. A problem arises when looking at the Kensington landscape if a force with adequate resources, personnel, and legal authority still cannot maintain order at the local scale. What does that say about the appropriateness of the current approach? Kensington is not without its own policing forces. What is different is that their level of intervention does not change the deeply ingrained reality of its functioning. When the entire system of administrative coercion is forced to act as a temporary policing mechanism rather than a re-establishment of the environment, the nature of the crisis is no longer a security one, it is a systemic one. Number 6. Policy money and loopholes. The Housing First policy, introduced in 2010, focuses on providing stable housing before requiring homeless people to engage in treatment or behavioral change. This principle is seen as a cornerstone of many modern urban regeneration models. However, only about 28% of homeless people in Kensington have access to permanent housing support. This is largely due to a lack of adequate supply and limited annual maintenance funding. At the same time, short-term shelters are constantly overcrowded. In the winter of 2024, the average occupancy rate at these facilities reached 95%, forcing many people to return to temporary tents. This leads to a paradox. There is a policy, but not enough space to enforce it. In an effort to intervene directly, the city has staged repeated camps, cleanup campaigns, each lasting about 3 to 5 days and involving a multi-agency task force. However, about 70% of displaced residents return to the same areas in less than 2 weeks. The lack of realistic alternatives makes these measures more of a surface cleanup than a root cause correction. At the state and federal levels, funding for social welfare programs continues to grow, but at a scale that is not sufficient to keep up with the pace of the problem. For example, Philadelphia's high-risk substance use prevention budget is down about 12% in 2024 compared to the same period last year, while the number of medical emergencies in Kensington is up nearly 20%. This inverse relationship puts pressure not only on implementation, but also on the retention of experienced intervention teams. In the midst of that, one thing to consider is that when the budget continues to be poured in, but social indicators are going in the opposite direction, does the current allocation still reflect real needs? The policy system is not lacking in goals. The problem is that the gap between goals and implementation mechanisms is widening. Kensington is a clear example of this. It is not that there is no money, but that the money is not going in the right direction and not fast enough to create sustainable change. Number 7, the losers are removed from the map. In many areas around Kensington, property prices have risen by nearly 40% in just 3 years. Part of this is due to a wave of investors buying up vacant properties with the aim of regenerating the neighborhood. Dozens of once boarded buildings have been converted into short-term rental apartments or converted to commercial use. On paper, this is a positive sign. But in practice, the changes have pushed low-income residents out of their long-time homes. When low-income people no longer have access to housing in the areas they once lived in, they are often pushed to the edges of cities where public transport is limited and employment opportunities are scarce. In many cases, people who were once living in former tenements are now forced to move into mobile homes, temporary storage units, or back to Kensington, where the cost of living is almost zero, but living conditions have deteriorated significantly. It is worth noting that this process is silent without the need for eviction or exclusionary policies. Its impact on the original community is more radical than an administrative relocation. When looking at the urban map, the changing color patches are obvious. But beyond the numbers and the area, what is of interest is who was actually chosen to continue to exist on that new map. Number 8. Children of Kensington. There are more than 10 regular meal distribution sites within a mile of Kensington Avenue. At certain times of the day, children line up with adults to receive basic meals. Some of these children do not have permanent homes. They live with relatives in old cars, temporary homes, or rented apartments. According to 2023 education statistics, more than 1,600 Philadelphia students are identified as being in housing instability. Nearly 40% of them are concentrated around Kensington. The uncontrolled living environment directly affects access to school services. Intermediate school transfers, long-term absenteeism, and early school dropout rates are significantly higher than the city average. Area juvenile support centers are often over capacity. In small-scale community interventions, the 12-16 age group is considered the most vulnerable because they are too young to enter the formal labor system, but are exposed to uncontrolled violence and stimulants. There are factors that can be improved by policy, but there are also things that cannot be measured by budgets. How does a child who grows up with the street as a shelter, the bus stop as a place to sleep and eat, and an empty lot as a playground shape? Number 9, same pain, different directions. While Kensington struggles with cleanups and short-term interventions, other cities facing similar problems have adopted a long-term stabilization model. In San Francisco, the Tenderloin has the highest concentration of homelessness and substance abuse in California. Los Angeles has more than 70,000 people without stable housing, with nearly 8,000 are living on Skid Row. Vancouver, Canada, though smaller in scale, has seen its downtown east side become the epicenter of a years-long public health crisis. Each city's response has made significant differences. Vancouver was one of the first in North America to implement controlled consumption centers, which reduced overdose emergency response rates in the region by nearly 35% between 2005 and 2015. The city also allowed for non-prosecution use of certain substances at low doses during the pilot period, combined with free on-site treatment support. San Francisco has focused on investing in micro-units of temporary housing and integrated treatment facilities, but has faced resistance due to a lack of consensus from neighboring neighborhoods. Meanwhile, Los Angeles has pushed for permanent housing with treatment, but progress has been slow due to land procedures and high construction costs. Among the above options, what many people are interested in is not just the results. Looking at the long-term perspective, why do some cities dare to apply unprecedented solutions while others are still struggling with short-term measures? When you look at a map of North America, hotspots like Kensington are no exception. But how cities are responding is showing that there's something more important than budgets. The ability to choose a course that works for the situation, rather than continuing to patch things up out of inertia. Number 10. Voices from within. The harm reduction centers in Kensington average more than 300 visits a day, many of whom return repeatedly in the same week. They come not just to receive medical help, but to feel part of a system, however temporary and fragile. At the Clean Needle and food distribution sites, the survey found that more than 60% of respondents had not had any contact with any public service outside of these locations in more than 3 months. That number reflects something clear for many people. Frontline organizations are more than just places to get material. They are the only place they have found a human presence who will listen without judgment. In an environment where health education and well-being indicators are low, personal cohesion unexpectedly becomes a factor that maintains relative stability. A seemingly loose model, but one that maintains the human connection and the most basic need to be recognized as part of a structure, however temporary. In a broader context, the paradox becomes clear. As more formal systems retreat from the region, informal networks become more central. When looking at how people in the region respond and adapt, consider what keeps a community connected when all the external supports are absent. The people who live in Kensington are not asking for special privileges. They need a steady supply of basic services, a system that is resilient enough to not abandon them after one mistake. And above all, they need to be seen not as a group of problems to be dealt with, but as a reality that exists among us. Destinations are not just about beautiful places. There are journeys that force us to observe from a close distance, even if it feels uncomfortable. NVL Travel Documentary chooses to look at them to better understand the rest of the city without avoiding or embellishing. If you find this content valuable, please leave your thoughts below, like, share with others, and subscribe to the channel to follow the next journey. Every interaction helps bring untold stories closer to more people.